Ahmed had always been the kind of person who never said no. From the moment he woke up in the morning until late at night, he seemed to exist to help others. Whether it was a friend asking for advice, a coworker needing help with a project, or a family member requesting a favor, Ahmed's instinct was always to say yes. He carried this sense of duty like a badge of honor, believing that his purpose was to make other people's lives easier, no matter the cost to himself. Initially, it gave him a sense of pride. People admired him, trusted him, and relied on him. They saw him as dependable, generous, and selfless, and for a while, Ahmed enjoyed the approval and the feeling of being indispensable. Yet, over time, a subtle exhaustion began to creep into his life, one that was easy to ignore at first but impossible to escape after months of constant giving. He noticed it first in small, almost imperceptible ways. He would finish a long day at work and still have unanswered messages from friends and family asking for favors. He would cancel plans with himself, postpone hobbies, or sacrifice sleep just to help someone else. He began to feel a heaviness, a quiet frustration that he couldn't quite articulate. Despite being constantly busy doing things for others, he realized he had no time for his own growth, no space to think about his own dreams, and no energy left for the simple joys that used to make him feel alive. He felt stretched thin, yet at the same time, guilty for even thinking about himself. He questioned why he felt this way, why being the person everyone relied on no longer brought satisfaction but a deep sense of fatigue. The turning point came unexpectedly, on a day that seemed ordinary. Ahmed's closest friend, Sarah, called him with a request that, at first glance, seemed simple. But for the first time, Ahmed paused. He noticed the tightness in his chest, the sudden awareness that he was exhausted. He felt a pang of resentment, tiny yet undeniable, for having to drop his own plans to accommodate someone else's need. It was confusing and uncomfortable, this new surge of emotion. For years, he had considered such feelings inappropriate. He had believed that his role was to be always available, that selflessness was the highest virtue. But now, confronted with this unexpected resistance within himself, he began to question everything. Am I living for myself at all, he thought. Or am I simply a tool for others to use, leaving no room for my own happiness or my own life? This realization was unsettling. Ahmed spent that evening in quiet reflection, a rare moment of stillness that allowed his thoughts to surface. He examined his daily routines, the endless chain of obligations, and the countless moments where he had sacrificed his own needs for the sake of someone else's convenience. It became clear that he had been living on autopilot, guided by an invisible force that prioritized everyone else's comfort above his own. The truth hit him hard. By always being there for others, he had neglected the one person who truly mattered in his life, himself. Ahmed knew that change was necessary, but the path forward was unclear. How could he maintain his kindness and generosity while also protecting his own well-being? How could he learn to say no without feeling guilty or fearing that he would be perceived as selfish? The answers did not come all at once, but he decided to start with awareness. He began observing his patterns, noting each time he said yes, even when he didn't want to. He reflected on how these decisions made him feel emotionally and physically, and he documented the energy he spent fulfilling other people's needs. Through this process, he realized that it was not his kindness itself that was the problem, it was the lack of boundaries. Ahmed understood that he could still be generous and supportive, but it had to be balanced with self-respect and limits. As he contemplated this, Ahmed experienced a mixture of fear and relief. Fear, because changing ingrained habits and confronting the reactions of others felt risky and uncertain. Relief, because he finally recognized that he had permission to prioritize himself, that his own life and well-being were valid reasons to step back when necessary. This moment marked the beginning of his journey toward understanding that true selflessness does not mean surrendering your own life to others' demands. True generosity, he realized, comes from a place of balance and inner strength. Ahmed's first steps were small and deliberate. He reminded himself daily that setting boundaries was not rejection, it was self-preservation. He practiced saying no in minor situations, choosing carefully where to invest his time and energy. Each small refusal was accompanied by discomfort, but also a growing sense of empowerment. With every boundary he set, Ahmed felt a little more in control of his life, a little more confident that he could be kind without losing himself in the process. The awareness alone was liberating, planting the seed for the transformation that was soon to come. By the end of this period of reflection, Ahmed understood a critical truth: he had been confusing availability with worth. He realized that being constantly accessible did not make him valuable. Rather, his respect and the authenticity of his help determined the quality of his relationships. For the first time, Ahmed felt the courage to redefine his life on his own terms, to honor his own needs while still extending genuine care to those who truly mattered. This insight, simple yet profound, set the stage for a journey of growth, self-respect, and balanced generosity, one that would not only change the way he interacted with others but transform his entire approach to life. After Ahmed decided to become more aware of his patterns, the real challenge began: learning how to set boundaries without feeling guilty, without fearing rejection, and without losing the people he cared about. He quickly realized that awareness alone was not enough. It was one thing to recognize the problem, but quite another to act differently in moments of habit. Saying no felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, a territory that made him anxious and uncomfortable. Every time someone asked for help, even for something minor, he felt a tug of conflict inside him. Part of him wanted to help, as he always had, but another part reminded him that he needed to protect his energy, that self-sacrifice had limits. His first real attempt at boundary setting came with a small request from a coworker. The task was doable, but Ahmed's schedule was already packed. In the past, he would have immediately said yes, jumping in without hesitation. But this time, he paused. He weighed his own commitments and realized that taking on this task would compromise his own responsibilities. He took a deep breath and politely said, "I'm sorry, I won't be able to take this on right now, but perhaps we can find an alternative solution." The moment the words left his mouth, he felt a rush of fear of judgment, fear of disappointment, fear that people would see him as selfish. Yet, surprisingly, the coworker responded with understanding. The simple acknowledgement that Ahmed had his limits did not ruin the relationship, it strengthened it. Ahmed felt a spark of confidence, realizing that boundaries were not bridges to conflict but pathways to respect. Ahmed's next challenge was even closer to home. Friends and family had grown accustomed to his constant availability. When he told a close friend he couldn't meet for a late-night favor, he sensed disappointment. Initially, guilt washed over him like a wave, threatening to pull him back into old habits. But he reminded himself of the reasons behind his decision: the exhaustion, the stress, the lost time for himself. He practiced explaining his boundaries clearly and kindly, communicating that he still cared deeply, but he also needed to honor his own time. Over time, these conversations became less tense. Some people understood immediately, while others needed repeated reinforcement. Ahmed learned patience, recognizing that changing long-standing expectations in relationships required consistency and honesty. Another important lesson came when Ahmed encountered resistance in the professional sphere. His boss, accustomed to Ahmed's compliance, presented an urgent project that demanded immediate attention. In the past, Ahmed would have worked tirelessly, staying late, sacrificing personal time, and risking burnout. This time, he paused, evaluating whether he could genuinely contribute effectively without compromising his well-being. Ahmed politely declined to take on the entire project alone but suggested a revised plan that distributed the workload more fairly among the team. His boss initially raised an eyebrow but ultimately respected Ahmed's approach. The experience taught him that assertiveness, when coupled with solutions and professionalism, could command respect rather than create conflict. As Ahmed continued this journey, he began noticing subtle but profound changes in his relationships. Those who genuinely valued him appreciated his honesty and clarity. People no longer took his kindness for granted because he had learned to protect it. Ahmed found himself surrounded by more authentic connections, friends, colleagues, and family members who respected his limits and understood his priorities. At the same time, relationships that were one-sided naturally shifted. Those who only reached out when they needed something gradually faded, and Ahmed no longer felt obligated or guilty about it. The realization was empowering: true connections are reciprocal, and energy should flow both ways. Through this process, Ahmed also discovered a new sense of freedom. He had more time for his own growth, for hobbies, for learning, and for reflection. The hours he once gave away indiscriminately were now invested in activities that enriched his life, not just others. He found joy in small things: reading books he had long ignored, going for long walks, practicing mindfulness, and even allowing himself moments of rest without guilt. The more he nurtured his own life, the more he realized that his capacity to help others was actually stronger when he was replenished. Generosity felt lighter, more genuine, and sustainable. At the heart of this transformation was a shift in mindset. Ahmed began to understand that self-care was not selfish. He realized that his worth was not measured by how much he could serve everyone else but by his integrity, his self-respect, and his ability to contribute meaningfully without losing himself. Saying no was no longer an act of defiance or rebellion, it became an act of self-respect and wisdom. Every refusal was a declaration that his time, energy, and emotions mattered. Over time, the anxiety and guilt that once accompanied these decisions diminished, replaced by a sense of calm authority over his own life. One day, Ahmed reflected on the journey he had undertaken. He remembered the early days of hesitation, guilt, and fear. He thought about the first small refusal he had made and the courage it took. Looking back, he realized that learning to say no, to set boundaries, and to protect his energy had transformed him into a stronger, more balanced, and more fulfilled person. His relationships were healthier, his work more productive, and his personal life richer. He understood that life did not demand constant self-sacrifice to prove worth. Rather, life rewarded those who respected themselves while helping others thoughtfully and purposefully. Ahmed's story during this phase was not about rejecting the world, it was about reclaiming himself. It was about understanding that true generosity stems from a place of wholeness, not depletion. It was about learning that boundaries do not push people away, they attract respect, authenticity, and meaningful connections. With each day, Ahmed became more confident in prioritizing his well-being, trusting that this balance would allow him to live a richer, more intentional, and deeply fulfilling life. Months had passed since Ahmed first began the difficult process of setting boundaries and reclaiming his time and energy. What had started as a small experiment had grown into a full transformation of the way he approached life. He no longer felt the constant pull to be available for everyone, and yet, paradoxically, his relationships felt deeper, richer, and more meaningful than ever before. He realized that by valuing himself, he had increased his capacity to genuinely value others. The exhaustion that had once shadowed him was replaced by energy, focus, and a renewed sense of purpose. Ahmed's mornings now began with intention. Instead of immediately checking messages or responding to requests, he would take a moment to prioritize his own needs, his own plans, and his own well-being. He began to notice the difference this made in his interactions with others. When he agreed to help someone, it was because he wanted to, because he could give fully and authentically, not because he felt obligated or afraid to say no. The quality of his support improved, and people could sense it. They felt the sincerity in his actions, and their gratitude was no longer taken for granted but truly earned through his mindful engagement. One of the most profound changes Ahmed noticed was the shift in his inner life. The anxiety and guilt that once accompanied the act of refusal had largely disappeared. Where there had been constant tension and fear of disappointing others, there was now a calm clarity. He understood that saying no did not make him a bad person, nor did it threaten his relationships. Instead, it allowed him to live with integrity, honoring his own values and needs while still showing kindness and care. This realization was liberating, giving him a sense of control over his life that he had never experienced before. Ahmed's relationships had transformed in remarkable ways. Friends who truly valued him understood and respected his boundaries. Their appreciation deepened because his help was no longer automatic or taken for granted, it was intentional, meaningful, and balanced. Colleagues noticed that his contributions were more focused and effective. His family, initially skeptical of his changes, gradually saw the positive impact on his mood, health, and overall presence. Even those who initially resisted or questioned his decisions eventually recognized that Ahmed's new approach created a healthier, more sustainable dynamic. He had learned that authentic connections thrive on mutual respect, not on constant self-sacrifice. Ahmed also found that his personal growth had accelerated. The hours he had once spent overextending himself were now devoted to pursuits that enriched his mind, body, and spirit. He returned to hobbies he had long abandoned, invested in learning new skills, and cultivated habits that fostered mental and emotional resilience. Meditation, exercise, journaling, and reading became regular parts of his routine, and each practice contributed to his growing sense of self-worth and stability. He realized that nurturing himself was not indulgent, it was essential. By being whole and fulfilled, he could offer his best self to others, rather than a depleted, resentful version. Another realization Ahmed embraced was that his worth was not dependent on how much he gave or how often he was available. For years, he had equated generosity with constant presence, believing that his value came from being indispensable. Now, he understood that true generosity is measured not by quantity but by quality, by intention and authenticity. He had discovered that he could impact others profoundly without exhausting himself or losing his sense of self. This insight gave him confidence and a sense of purpose that no external validation could ever match. Ahmed's transformation also carried a broader lesson about life. He realized that personal boundaries and self-respect are not just tools for managing energy, they are principles that allow a person to live intentionally. By defining what was acceptable and what was not, he created a framework for a life that aligned with his values and priorities. He understood that it was impossible to please everyone, and that attempting to do so had only led to frustration and emptiness. True fulfillment, he discovered, comes from respecting oneself while engaging with the world in a balanced and deliberate way. As Ahmed reflected on his journey, he could see the profound impact of his choices. He remembered the early days of guilt, fear, and hesitation, and he marveled at how far he had come. The simple act of pausing before saying yes, of considering his own limits, and of communicating his boundaries had transformed not only his life but also the lives of those around him. He had become a model of healthy self-respect, showing that it is possible to care deeply for others without losing oneself in the process. In this final stage of his transformation, Ahmed fully embraced the balance between generosity and self-care. He no longer felt the constant pressure to be available, yet he was more helpful, kind, and present than ever. He had learned that boundaries are not barriers but bridges to deeper, more authentic relationships. He had discovered that self-respect amplifies impact, that caring without limits leads to burnout, and that a life guided by intention creates lasting fulfillment. Ahmed's story became a testament to the power of saying no when necessary, of prioritizing oneself, and of living a life that honors both others and oneself. By living in this way, Ahmed had not only reclaimed his time, energy, and peace of mind but had also discovered the secret to sustainable generosity. He knew that life would continue to present challenges and requests, but he was no longer a passive participant swept along by obligation. He was a conscious creator of his own experience, empowered to make choices that balanced kindness with self-respect, compassion with boundaries, and giving with living fully. His journey was not merely about learning to say no, it was about learning to live intentionally, to be present authentically, and to honor both his own needs and the needs of others. Ahmed's transformation was complete. He had stopped being always available for everyone, and in doing so, he had found the freedom, respect, and fulfillment that had always eluded him. He had learned that the most meaningful way to help others is to first help oneself, and that by living with clarity, intention, and balance, one can create a life that is both generous and deeply satisfying. In choosing to honor his own life, Ahmed became more capable of honoring the lives of those around him, and in this balance, he discovered the true power of living with purpose.